The scent of wilting lilies hung heavy in the air, a sweet, cloying perfume of decay that mirrored the state of her life. In the dim backroom of her Brooklyn flower shop, Clara's hands trembled as she clutched her phone, the screen a stark white beacon in the gloom. Her landlord's voice, a venomous whisper from earlier that day, echoed in her mind. Threats disguised as business, ultimatums wrapped in a greasy smile. With a shaky breath, she pressed record, her voice a fragile thread of sound, weaving through the oppressive silence. She spoke of fear, of the crushing weight of a city that demanded more than she had, of the quiet humiliation of being cornered. In a final, desperate fumble, her thumb slipped, the screen flashed, and the raw, bleeding edge of her soul was sent not to her friend, but out into the vast, indifferent darkness. But she sent it to the wrong number, a mistake that would unravel her world, and if you watch until the end, you will discover who was on the other side of that silence. Subscribe now, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Clara, at 28, was a woman shaped by quiet resilience. Her life was a study in muted colors, a lonely existence spent between the fragile beauty of her flowers and the stark reality of her ledger. She had inherited the shop, petal and stem, from her mother, and with it, a legacy of debt that clung to her like a second skin. Her dignity was a silent, stubborn thing, visible in the careful way she wrapped a single rose or the gentle firmness with which she swept the floor each night. It was a strength born not of defiance, but of a deep-seated refusal to let the harshness of the world extinguish the small, soft light she carried within her, a light she feared was beginning to flicker and fade under the constant pressure. The shop itself was both her sanctuary and her cage. During the day, sunlight would filter through the large front window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, and casting a warm glow on buckets of vibrant hydrangeas and delicate baby's breath. But at night, the space transformed. The humming of the floral cooler became a mournful drone, the shadows in the corners grew longer and deeper, and the reflections in the dark glass showed her a ghost of a woman, trapped behind a barrier of her own making. The sounds of the city outside, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the subway beneath the floorboards, served only to amplify her profound sense of isolation, making her small world feel even smaller and more constricting. Her moral compass was an unyielding instrument, a true north she clung to in a world that seemed to have lost its way. She saw injustice in the smallest of things, the way the powerful spoke down to the service workers, the casual cruelty of a dismissive glance, the systemic unfairness that kept good people struggling while the corrupt thrived. This acute sense of right and wrong was a burden, making her feel perpetually out of step with her surroundings. It was the reason she couldn't simply walk away from the shop, couldn't surrender to the landlord's predatory demands. To do so would be to admit that her integrity was a currency she was willing to trade, and that was a price she was not yet prepared to pay, no matter how high the cost of resistance. The pressure from her landlord, a man named Gallo, with eyes that strip people of their worth, had become a physical presence in her life. It was a knot in her stomach, a tightness in her chest. His threats were never direct, always veiled in legal jargon and patronizing smiles, which made them all the more terrifying. He wanted the property, a prime piece of a gentrifying neighborhood, and she was merely an obstacle to be removed. The eviction notices were piling up, each one a paper testament to her failure. She felt the walls closing in, the options dwindling until all that was left was this suffocating, paralyzing fear that had prompted her desperate, misdirected plea for a witness to her struggle. She often found herself lost in memories of a time before the silence, before the shop became a mausoleum of her past. A faded photograph tucked into the frame of her desk mirror showed a smiling family, a man and a woman with their arms around a younger, brighter version of herself. They were gone, taken by a swift and senseless tragedy that had left her adrift. The flowers were her only remaining connection to them, to the warmth and love that had once filled her life. This history of loss had forged her independence, but it had also left a hollow space inside her, a vulnerability that she guarded fiercely, unaware that it was this very fragility that could be her greatest strength or her ultimate undoing. As she finally locked the front door, a profound sense of unease washed over her, cold and sharp. Across the street, parked under the sickly orange glow of a streetlight, sat a black sedan. It was sleek, silent, and impossibly out of place against the backdrop of graffiti-laced brick and worn-down storefronts. Its windows were tinted, reflecting the city lights back with an unnerving, impenetrable sheen. It hadn't moved for over an hour. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a primal instinct warning her that a new, far more dangerous shadow had just fallen over her life. The world had heard her whisper, and something in the darkness had decided to listen. The morning light, thin and gray, did little to dispel the lingering chill of the night. The black sedan was gone, but its impression remained. A dark spot burned into her memory. Clara moved through her small apartment above the shop, with an economy of motion born from years of solitary routine. The worn floral apron, a ghost of her mother's, was tied around her waist, a familiar shield against the day. Each gesture was a quiet ritual, the brewing of coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, the careful locking of the door behind her, the walk to the bus stop under the watchful eyes of a city that never truly slept. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp pavement, a stark contrast to the fragile perfume she curated for a living. Her world was one of textures, rough concrete, cold metal, and the persistent gnawing ache of exhaustion in her bones. The crosstown bus was a rolling microcosm of the city's forgotten souls, a capsule of quiet desperation hurtling through the dawn. Clara found a seat by a window slick with condensation. Her reflection, a pale, translucent version of herself, superimposed over the gritty Brooklyn streets. She watched the faces around her, each one a story of struggle etched into the lines around their eyes and the set of their jaws. They were all running, all fighting a current that threatened to pull them under. In the distance, the jagged skyline of Manhattan rose like a fortress of impossible dreams, a world of glass and steel so close yet utterly unattainable. It was a daily reminder of the chasm between her life and the lives of those who moved effortlessly through spheres of power and influence, a world she only ever glimpsed through her shop window. Her day began not with beauty, but with the harsh reality of the wholesale flower market. Before the sun had fully risen, she navigated the cavernous refrigerated warehouses, her breath misting in the cold air. The scent of thousands of flowers, which should have been intoxicating, was merely the smell of inventory, of overhead, of survival. Here, there was no room for sentiment. Negotiations were blunt, prices were firm, and every dollar was a battle. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her eye for quality sharp and unforgiving. This was the engine room of her fragile enterprise, a place where the romance of her profession was stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard calculus of profit and loss, a constant reminder that even beauty had a price she could barely afford to pay. Back in the sanctuary of her shop, the tyranny of the clock began. Each tick was a countdown to another bill due, another payment missed. An official-looking envelope, slipped under the door overnight, lay waiting on the mat. She recognized the letterhead of a collections agency. Her hands, steady moments before as she trimmed the thorns from a dozen white roses, now trembled slightly as she opened it. The words were sterile, impersonal, yet they felt like a physical blow, tightening the knot of anxiety that lived permanently in her stomach. She folded the letter carefully, hiding it beneath a stack of invoices, as if concealing the evidence of a crime. To the outside world, she was the proprietor of a charming neighborhood shop. Within these four walls, she was a prisoner of escalating debt. A small, elderly woman entered the shop, her steps hesitant. She wanted a single gardenia, explaining in a quiet voice that it was for her husband's birthday, his first since he'd passed away. Clara listened with a gentle, focused attention that made the woman feel seen. She selected the most perfect bloom, its petals like creamy velvet, and wrapped it not in simple paper but in silk ribbon, placing it in a small box as if it were a precious jewel. She refused payment, offering a soft smile and a quiet word of comfort. This was her rebellion. In a world that measured worth in dollars and cents, she insisted on trading in a different currency: kindness, empathy, and a shared understanding of grief. It was an act of defiance that cost her profit but preserved her soul. Lunch was a solitary affair, a hastily eaten sandwich in the cramped back room, surrounded by buckets of wilting stems and the earthy smell of soil. The silence was a heavy blanket, amplifying the hum of the floral cooler and the frantic beating of her own heart. She allowed herself a moment to scroll through her phone, a window into lives that were not her own. She saw pictures of college friends on vacation, celebrating promotions, holding newborn babies. A profound sense of being left behind washed over her, a quiet ache of loneliness that was more persistent than any hunger. She was an island, and the waters around her were rising, threatening to submerge the last vestiges of the life she had once imagined for herself. Her gaze drifted to the faded photograph tucked into the frame of a small mirror. Her parents, smiling, their arms wrapped around a teenage Clara, their faces full of a light she rarely saw in her own anymore. The shop was all she had left of them, a living, breathing memorial to their love. She held on to it with a fierce, desperate grip, not because it was a viable business, but because letting it go felt like a final, unforgivable betrayal. It was her last connection to a past where she had felt safe, where the world had seemed full of promise instead of peril. Every flower she arranged, every customer she served, was a silent tribute to them, a promise to keep their memory alive, even if the effort was slowly breaking her. The afternoon wore on, the city's relentless energy seeping through the glass, feeling less like vitality and more like an assault. The misdirected voice note returned to her thoughts, a source of low-grade, persistent dread. Who had received it? A stranger who had deleted it without a thought? Or something worse? The uncertainty was a poison, clouding her judgment and fraying her already thin nerves. She tried to reason with herself, to dismiss the black sedan and the unanswered message as products of an overactive imagination fueled by stress. But the feeling of being watched, of having exposed her deepest vulnerability to an unknown entity, clung to her like the cloying scent of funeral lilies. The bell above the door chimed, a harsh, discordant sound that made her jump. It was Gallo, her landlord. He didn't bother with greetings, his presence instantly souring the air in the small shop. He moved with an oily confidence, his expensive suit a mockery of the struggling businesses around him. He ran a finger over a dusty shelf, a silent judgment of her housekeeping, of her life. "Clara, Clara," he began, his voice a condescending purr. "We need to talk about your future, or rather the lack of one in this location." He laid a new eviction notice on the counter, its bold red letters a declaration of war. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and malice. "The offer expires Friday. After that, the locks change." He left as abruptly as he arrived, leaving a wake of humiliation and cold fear. Clara stood frozen behind the counter, the legal document, a brand on her skin. The scent of the flowers around her suddenly seemed suffocating, their beauty a cruel joke in the face of such ugliness. She felt stripped bare, her quiet dignity shredded by his casual cruelty. The bell chimed again, her head snapped up, her body tensing for another assault. But it was not Gallo. A man stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing silhouette against the fading afternoon light. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, and his stillness was more commanding than any shout. He said nothing, but his eyes, deep and unreadable, swept over the small shop, and then they settled on her. This man was not an interruption. He was a cessation. The air in the small shop, already thick with the scent of flowers and fear, seemed to grow still and heavy, condensing around him. He was tall, dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the fading light, tailored with a precision that spoke of immense wealth and discipline. His stillness was absolute, a predator's economy of motion that made every other movement in the world seem clumsy and loud. His face was a study in sharp angles and controlled expression, but his eyes, they were old, carrying the weight of things Clara could not begin to imagine. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had become its master. She felt a fear so profound it was almost reverent, a silence falling over her mind that drowned out Gallo's recent taunts. He moved from the doorway with a slow, deliberate grace, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the worn wooden floor. His gaze drifted from the buckets of vibrant, fresh-cut carnations to the wilting hydrangeas in the corner, his expression unreadable. It was not the look of a customer admiring her wares. It was the look of an appraiser, someone calculating the value and vulnerability of everything he saw. He seemed to take in the entire narrative of her life in one sweeping, silent glance. The struggle, the quiet dignity, the encroaching decay. Under his scrutiny, Clara felt utterly exposed, as if the very walls of her shop had turned to glass, revealing the debts in her ledger and the fractures in her soul. He stopped at the counter, creating a chasm of space between them that felt both vast and suffocatingly intimate. He did not glance at the eviction notice lying there, dismissing it with an indifference more potent than any contempt. His focus was entirely on her, his gaze intense and analytical. For a fleeting second, the hard mask of his control seemed to slip, and she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. A deep, ancient weariness, the exhaustion of a man who carried the burden of 1,000 violent secrets. It was a crack in the marble facade, a hint of a wound that would never heal, and it was the most human thing she had seen in him, which only made him more terrifying. A maelstrom of questions swirled in Clara's mind, each one silenced by the sheer force of his presence. He was not a bill collector, nor a city official. He was something other, something from the shadowed world that operated by a different set of rules. The fear she felt was primal, but it was laced with a strange, unsettling calm. Gallo's pay tyranny felt like a child's tantrum, in comparison to the immense, controlled power radiating from this man. She understood instinctively that he was not here to threaten her. He was here because a threat had been made, and his arrival was the consequence. Her small, contained world had been breached by an ocean, and she was drowning in its silent, powerful depths. He finally spoke, and his voice was a low, resonant sound that seemed to hum in the very bones of the building. It was rough, like gravel wrapped in velvet, and it held an authority that needed no volume. "Clara," he said. The simple utterance of her name from his lips felt both like a brand and a violation. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation that he knew exactly who she was, where she was, and the shape of the cage that had been built around her. The unasked question, "How do you know my name?" died on her tongue. To ask would be to challenge him, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was not a man to be challenged. His attention shifted to a bucket of white roses on the counter, the one she had been preparing before Gallo's arrival. He reached out, his hand surprisingly elegant, his nails immaculately clean. He lifted a single rose, his long fingers brushing against the delicate petals with a touch that was astonishingly gentle. It was a gesture of profound contradiction, a moment of unexpected softness from a man who seemed forged from steel and shadow. He studied the perfect bloom, its innocent white, a stark contrast to the darkness of his suit. She felt as though he were not just seeing a flower, but seeing her, the fragile, beautiful thing she tried to cultivate in a world determined to crush it. Then his gaze lifted from the rose and locked with hers. It was a moment of pure, unshielded connection that felt more intimate than any touch. The air crackled, the silence between them filled with unspoken words, with the collision of two worlds that should never have met. In the depths of his dark eyes, she saw more than just power and control. She saw a flicker of recognition, a profound loneliness that resonated with the hollow ache in her own chest. It was a dangerous, magnetic pull, a glimpse into an abyss that both terrified her and called to a forgotten part of her soul. She felt her defenses crumble, her carefully constructed walls turning to dust under the weight of his stare. He placed the rose back into the water, his movements as precise and final as a judge's gavel. The moment of connection was severed, the mask of cold authority sliding back into place. He did not need to mention Gallo or the eviction notice. His presence had rendered them insignificant, artifacts from a lesser conflict. "You won't be bothered again," he stated, the words hanging in the air with the finality of a death sentence. It was not a promise of help. It was a declaration of ownership, a claim staked on her life by a power she could not comprehend. He had passed judgment, and in doing so had irrevocably bound her fate to his. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The bell above the door chimed, a small, fragile sound in the wake of his immense presence. Through the front window, she saw him step into the black sedan from the night before, which had materialized at the curb as if summoned from the shadows. The car pulled away smoothly, merging with the city traffic and vanishing without a trace. He left behind a silence that was more profound than before, a void filled with the echo of his voice and the weight of his unspoken power. The air in the shop felt different, charged with a new, more potent kind of danger. Clara stood motionless for a long time, her hand gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. The scent of the flowers around her seemed to have changed, now laced with the faint, expensive fragrance of his cologne, a lingering ghost of his visit. The eviction notice on the counter looked pathetic, a flimsy piece of paper from a world that no longer held any power here. She had been saved, she knew that with a cold, terrifying certainty. But she had not been rescued. She had been claimed. She had whispered her fear into the darkness, and the darkness itself had answered. The days that followed were defined by a new kind of silence. Gallo was gone, vanished from her life as if he had never existed. No calls, no letters, no oily smile lurking in her doorway. The relief she expected never came. Instead, it was replaced by a quiet, humming anxiety, a sense of being observed by an invisible, omnipotent force. She would catch herself looking over her shoulder on the street, her eyes scanning the dark windows of passing cars. The shop, once her cage, now felt like a gilded one, its safety conditional and its terms unwritten. She was no longer a victim of a petty tyrant. She was now a subject in an unseen kingdom, and she did not know the rules of its king. His presence manifested in coincidences that felt too precise to be accidental. One evening, while walking home in a sudden downpour, a black sedan identical to his pulled up beside her. The back window lowered just enough to reveal a stoic driver who offered her a large black umbrella without a word. She hesitated, rain plastering her hair to her face, before taking it with a trembling hand. The car drove off, leaving her standing under the silent, sturdy protection of his influence. The umbrella was expensive, its fabric a deep, impenetrable silk. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt like a brand, a tangible reminder that she was under his watch, sheltered by a storm far more dangerous than the one raging around her. She tried to maintain the fiction of her old life, to push the memory of his dark eyes and gravelly voice to the back of her mind. She focused on the familiar rituals, trimming stems, arranging bouquets, the quiet accounting at the end of the day. But his world kept bleeding into hers. A large, anonymous order for white roses, her favorite flower, the one he had touched, would arrive for delivery to a penthouse suite in a part of the city she had only ever seen in magazines. She would stand in opulent marble lobbies, feeling small and out of place, a ghost from another world delivering beauty to the powerful. She never saw him, but she felt his unseen hand orchestrating these small, unsettling intersections of their lives. One night, making a late delivery to an exclusive rooftop restaurant, the very one from the mistaken call, she saw him. He was seated at a secluded table in the corner, surrounded by men whose faces were hard and unsmiling. They spoke in low tones, the city's glittering skyline a backdrop to their shadowed council. He was listening, his expression a mask of cold control. But his eyes were not on them. They were on her as she placed the floral arrangement on a nearby table. The noise of the restaurant faded to a dull roar. For a long, breathless moment, the vast, luxurious space shrank to the charged distance between them, a taut, invisible line connecting her fragile world to his brutal one. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that was both a dismissal and a claim. It sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unwelcome flutter of recognition. She quickly finished her work, her hands unsteady, acutely aware of his gaze following her every move. As she left, she felt the weight of it on her back, a physical pressure that was more intimidating than any spoken threat. She was an anomaly in his world, a splash of soft color in his monochrome existence of power and violence. She knew she should be terrified of the attention, yet a part of her, a part she refused to name, was drawn to the intensity of his focus. He, in turn, found himself captivated by the quiet defiance she embodied. He watched her from afar, a silent observer of her small acts of integrity. He saw her give a free bouquet to a crying child, saw her patiently listen to a lonely old man's stories, saw the unwavering honesty in her eyes when she dealt with her suppliers. She moved through a world that had tried to break her, yet she remained whole, her spirit unbent. In her, he saw a reflection of a life he might have lived, a moral clarity he had long ago sacrificed at the altar of power. She was a mirror, showing him the man he could never be, and the sight was both a comfort and a torment. This fascination was a weakness, a crack in the fortress of control he had spent a lifetime building. His lieutenants noticed the shift, the moments his attention would drift, the uncharacteristic softness that would flicker in his eyes when her name was mentioned in reports. She was a complication he hadn't anticipated, a variable in an equation he had always managed to solve with brutality or money. But she could not be bought, and she could not be broken by conventional means. This made her both an object of his protection and the most significant threat to the cold, orderly darkness he commanded. To feel anything for her was to invite chaos into his life. The tension between them grew with each near encounter, a silent conversation held in lingering glances and charged spaces. One afternoon, they found themselves in the same crowded elevator of a downtown office building where she was delivering an orchid plant. The air grew thick, heavy with their unspoken awareness of each other. She stood, pressed against the polished wood paneling, her gaze fixed on the changing floor numbers, intensely conscious of him standing just behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne over the sterile air of the elevator. The silence was absolute, a vacuum where only the sound of her own frantic heartbeat existed. As the elevator jolted to a stop at her floor, she stumbled slightly, a small spray of baby's breath falling from the arrangement she was holding. Before she could react, his hand shot out, catching the delicate white sprig just before it hit the floor. He held it for a moment, his long, elegant fingers, a stark contrast to the flower's innocence. He then offered it back to her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated energy that shot up her arm and straight to her heart. It was a touch so light it was barely there, yet it felt more significant than any kiss. She took the flower, her voice a choked whisper of thanks. His eyes held hers, and in their dark depths, she saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. It was a look that said he felt it too, this dangerous, undeniable pull that defied logic and reason. The elevator doors began to close, and he held them open with his hand, a gesture of quiet courtesy that seemed utterly at odds with the man he was supposed to be. For that one moment, he was not a mafia boss, and she was not a frightened florist. They were just a man and a woman, caught in a silent, impossible gravity. He began to seek out these small moments, manufacturing reasons to be in her orbit. He would visit the high-end art gallery across the street from her shop, his car parked where she could see it, a silent sentinel in her periphery. He learned her routine, the time she went to the market, the cafe where she bought her morning coffee. It was not stalking. It was a form of silent, possessive guardianship. He was studying her, trying to understand the source of the light she carried, perhaps hoping some of it might touch the darkness within him. For Clara, his constant silent presence became a strange sort of comfort, a dangerous habit she knew she should break. Her fear of him began to war with a growing, complicated empathy. She saw past the myth, past the terrifying reputation, to the profound loneliness that clung to him like a shroud. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own making, a king on a throne of isolation. She started to see his protection, not as an act of ownership, but as a desperate attempt to preserve something pure, in a world he had dedicated his life to corrupting. She was his penance, his secret act of redemption, and this realization terrified her more than any threat of violence, because it meant they were connected by something far deeper than fear. This fragile, unspoken understanding was a dangerous indulgence for them both. He was a man with countless enemies, men who would see his fascination with a simple florist as a glaring weakness to be exploited. His protection placed her in the crosshairs, making her an unwitting pawn in games she didn't know were being played. His desire to keep her safe was the very thing that put her in the greatest danger. He knew he should walk away, sever the connection, and let her return to her simple, difficult life. But the thought of returning to a world without her light had become unbearable, a prospect more terrifying than any rival. The city itself seemed to conspire to bring them together. A charity gala, for which her shop had been commissioned to provide the centerpieces, was the next stage for their collision. She was there to make last-minute adjustments, moving through the opulent ballroom like a shadow among the city's elite. He was there too, a dark star around which all other bodies orbited, a figure of immense power cloaked in a tuxedo. She tried to remain invisible, but his eyes found her, as they always did. He watched her gently adjust a stray lily, her touch delicate and sure, and the world of politics and power around him seemed to dissolve into meaningless noise. Later, as she was leaving through a service corridor, a man stepped out from the shadows, blocking her path. He was not one of Damien's men. His suit was too flashy, his smile too predatory. "Clara," he said, his voice slick and familiar in a way that made her skin crawl. "Damien Costello keeps interesting company these days. He's a busy man. I'm sure he wouldn't mind if I kept you occupied." The man took a step closer, his intentions a palpable threat in the confined space. Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. This was the consequence she had been dreading, the moment his world finally reached out to swallow her whole. Before she could scream, a presence filled the corridor behind her. Damien. He had not made a sound, but the temperature in the narrow hall seemed to drop by 20 degrees. He did not look at the other man. His gaze was fixed on Clara, his expression a terrifying calm that barely concealed a storm of cold fury. "There has been a misunderstanding," Damien said, his voice a low, deadly whisper that cut through the air like a razor. "She is with me." The words were a shield and a cage, a declaration that sealed her fate more surely than any contract. He moved to her side, his hand closing around her upper arm. His grip was not painful, but it was absolute, an anchor of immense power in her sea of fear. The other man's predatory smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, stammering an apology before practically fleeing down the corridor. Damien didn't watch him go. He was looking down at Clara, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her arm in a gesture that was both possessive and strangely reassuring. In his eyes, she saw not a monster, but a protector, and she realized with a sickening lurch that she was no longer afraid of him, but for him. His hand on her arm was a manacle of terrifying security, the warmth of his skin seeping through the thin fabric of her sleeve, branding her. The corridor was suddenly a vacuum, the muffled sounds of the gala a world away. He did not release her. He stood as a bulwark between her and the world that had just threatened to consume her, his body a shield of dark, tailored wool and coiled violence. In the stark, fluorescent light, she saw the tightly controlled fury in his jaw, a muscle twitching just beneath the skin. It was the terrifying, beautiful calm of a storm's eye, a stillness that promised utter devastation. The fear she had felt moments before was replaced by a dizzying, dangerous sense of belonging. She was not his prisoner, she was his territory, and he had just drawn the borders in blood. He finally let go, the abrupt absence of his touch leaving her skin cold. He took a half-step back, the movement stiff, as if his own body were betraying him. The mask of cold indifference he wore so well had been shattered, and what lay beneath was something raw and unguarded. He looked not at her, but at the empty space where the other man had stood, his eyes narrowed with a chilling finality. He was a king who had just been forced to reveal his most treasured secret, and the fury he felt was directed not at the thief, but at himself, for having a treasure to begin with. The air crackled with his self-recrimination, with the monumental weight of a code he had just broken for her. He had made her real, and in his world, to be real was to be a target. Breaking the spell of her own silence, a rule she had lived by her entire life, she found her voice. It was fragile, but it did not tremble. He was right, wasn't he? The words were quiet, but they struck the charged air like a hammer on glass. I'm a complication, a weakness. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, a sad acceptance of her role in his brutal narrative. She was looking at him with an unnerving clarity, seeing past the power and the fear to the impossible choice he had just made. By speaking the truth of her position, she was refusing to be a passive victim. She was demanding to be seen as a person, not a possession, even if that person was a liability he could no longer afford. Without a word, he took her arm again, his grip firm but no longer possessive. It was urgent. He pulled her along, away from the service corridor, and into the hushed, opulent labyrinth of the hotel's private hallways. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of their footsteps, creating an eerie silence punctuated only by the frantic beating of her heart. He moved with a predator's purpose, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the gilded emptiness. He was not taking her to safety. He was spiriting her away from the scene of his own crime, the place where he had irrevocably exposed his own heart. Each step they took was a step further away from her old life and deeper into the beautiful, terrifying darkness of his. He stopped before a set of glass doors leading to a deserted stone terrace, the city lights glittering below like a carpet of fallen stars. He released her and turned, cornering her not with his body but with the sheer intensity of his gaze. Weakness, he repeated, his voice a low, guttural sound of pure frustration. You have no idea. He struck the cold stone balustrade with his fist, the impact a sharp, contained crack in the night's silence. The violence was shocking in its control, directed at the unyielding stone instead of the world. He will not be the last. To them, you are a key, a vulnerability, a way to get to me. By protecting you, I have put you in more danger than you have ever known. It was not an apology. It was a confession. In that moment, all her fear for herself vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, aching empathy for him. She saw the profound loneliness of his power, the terrible price of his control. He was a man drowning in a darkness of his own creation, and she was the one, impossible sliver of light he had reached for. Without thinking, without allowing her mind to veto the impulse of her heart, she closed the small space between them. She raised a trembling hand, not in a caress, but in a simple, grounding gesture. Her palm came to rest flat against the starched white front of his shirt, directly over his heart. She could feel its strong, steady rhythm beneath her hand, a secret, vital drumbeat in the silent night. He flinched as if her touch were a brand, his entire body going rigid. He stared down at her small hand on his chest, his breath catching in his throat. No one touched him. Not with gentleness, not without invitation, not without fear. Her simple, compassionate gesture was a more profound violation of his defenses than any rival's blade. It was an act of unconditional acceptance, a quiet statement that she was not afraid of the monster, because she could feel the man's heart beating beneath. For a long, suspended moment, the Emperor was gone, and only Damien remained, a man seeing himself for the first time in years through the eyes of unwavering empathy. He closed his eyes, a silent, momentary surrender. When he opened them again, the hard mask was gone, and his gaze was stripped bare, holding a universe of pain and weary regret. "They call me a monster because I destroy beautiful things," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "I wanted to protect you because you are the only beautiful thing I have ever wanted to see grow." The confession hung between them, more intimate than any kiss, more binding than any vow. He was not a savior. He was a man who had found his one reason to defy his own nature, and in doing so, had damned them both. He was the storm, and she was the single, fragile flower he had tried, and failed, to shield from his own destructive path. The truth of his words settled in the cold night air, a fragile, terrible crystal. Everything was different now. The unspoken had been spoken, the untouchable had been touched. She had seen the soul he kept hidden from the world, and he had admitted that she was its keeper. There was no going back from this precipice. He had not just saved her from a man in a corridor. He had confessed that she was his one, singular exception in a life built on absolute rules. This confession was not a promise of a future, but a guarantee of a dangerous, uncertain present. The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of consequences yet to come, the first tremor of an earthquake he had triggered. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped back, severing the connection. The king was reassembling his armor, but the pieces no longer fit correctly. A deep, invisible crack had fractured the cold facade forever. He turned away from her, his back a rigid wall of black wool against the glittering city. "My driver will take you home," he said, his voice once again distant, controlled, but lacking its former icy edge. It was an order, but it felt like a plea. A plea for her to be safe, to be gone, from this moment, from this world he could no longer keep her from. As she stood alone on the terrace, watching him disappear back into the gilded cage of the hotel, she knew. He hadn't just saved her life tonight. He had irrevocably bound it to his, and the price of that bond was a war he had just declared on the world for her. The ride back to Brooklyn was a journey through a silent underwater world. Seated in the back of the sedan, wrapped in a velvet cage of supple leather and tinted glass, Clara watched the city lights bleed into abstract streaks of neon and gold. The driver, a man with a face carved from stone, never spoke, the silence between them thick with the unsaid aftermath of the terrace. This was no longer just a car. It was an extension of Damien's will, a quiet, powerful instrument of his protection. The air still carried the faint, expensive scent of his world, a mix of cold rain, wool, and something uniquely him. She was being returned to her life, but she knew with a chilling certainty that the woman who had left the flower shop that morning was not the same one being delivered back to its door. Her shop, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage. The familiar scent of damp earth and fresh-cut lilies was a fragile perfume against the memory of his violent, protective aura. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the old floorboards a potential threat. The absence of Gallo was a palpable void, a testament to a power that could erase a man from existence as easily as one might swat a fly. She was safe, but the safety was a gilded cage, its bars forged from the cold fury she had witnessed in Damien's eyes. She moved through her days in a haze, her hands performing the familiar tasks of arranging flowers, while her mind replayed the feeling of his heart beating steadily beneath her palm, a secret rhythm in a world of chaos. From his penthouse office, a sterile fortress of glass and steel high above the city, Damien orchestrated the fallout. The rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the controlled storm within him. His orders were delivered in a low, dispassionate tone, each word a precise, lethal instrument. The man from the corridor, a rival named Rico, ceased to be a problem. His businesses faltered, his associates disappeared, his world dismantled with the silent, surgical efficiency that had made Damien a king. There was no rage in the commands, only the cold, absolute finality of a line that had been crossed. He was reasserting his dominion, reminding the underworld that his world, and everything in it, was untouchable. But control was a lie, he told the world. In the solitude of the night, with the city a glittering, indifferent carpet below, his discipline fractured. He would stand for hours, staring into the rain-streaked darkness, the reflection in the glass showing him not a king, but a man haunted by the memory of a gentle touch. Her hand on his chest had been a brand, a point of entry into a fortress he had believed impregnable. He knew what he had to do. To keep her safe, he had to become a ghost, to erase his presence from her life as completely as he had erased Rico. He had to cut the invisible thread that now bound them, even if the act of severing it felt like tearing out a part of his own soul. The weeks that followed were defined by a profound and aching silence. The black sedan no longer kept its silent vigil across the street. The anonymous, extravagant orders for white roses ceased. The subtle signs of his watchful presence vanished, leaving behind a void that was colder and more terrifying than his proximity had ever been. Clara found herself scanning the streets, a part of her searching for the dark, sleek car, for a sign that she was not completely alone. The freedom from his watch was not liberating. It was a desolation. He had pulled her from the path of a petty tyrant, only to leave her stranded on a deserted island of his own making. The silence, a constant, screaming reminder of his absence. Rainy nights became a particular form of torture. She would stand at the window of her small apartment above the shop, watching the water trace lonely paths down the cold glass, blurring the world outside into an impressionist painting of sorrow. The city, once a source of oppressive noise, was now a silent film playing out before her, its millions of inhabitants living lives untouched by the impossible bargain she had witnessed. She would press her forehead against the cool pain, the barrier between her and the world, a tangible representation of her isolation. He was out there, somewhere in that sea of lights, a solitary lighthouse she was no longer allowed to see. Unseen, he kept his vigil. From the tinted windows of a car parked several blocks away, a position of strategic, painful distance, he would watch her. He saw her silhouette, moving behind the steamed-up glass of her shop, a small, resilient flame of life in the encroaching dusk. This self-imposed exile was a penance, a necessary cruelty to protect the one thing he had ever deemed pure. To see her living, breathing, and safe, even if that safety required his complete withdrawal, was the only form of redemption he would allow himself. He was a phantom guardian, a king who had abdicated his right to stand in the light of his own protected realm, choosing instead to rule from the shadows. The ache of his absence began to transform within her. The initial, sharp pain of abandonment slowly hardened into a quiet, resilient strength. Her fear of the world had been cauterized by a much greater fire, and what remained was a core of unexpected resolve. She was no longer just the cornered florist. She had stood on a terrace with the city's most dangerous man, and had not flinched. She began to carry herself differently, her spine straighter, her gaze more direct. This newfound lucidity was his unintended gift to her, a painful, irreversible maturation. She had survived his world, and in doing so, had discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. One afternoon, while cleaning out a back closet, she found the black silk umbrella he had given her. It was a relic from their shared storm, a tangible piece of his protection. For a moment, she considered throwing it away, a symbolic severing of their bond, a declaration of her own independence. But she couldn't. It was more than just an object. It was the memory of a choice, of a man breaking his own code to shield her from the rain. With a quiet sigh, she folded it carefully and placed it back in the darkness of the closet. It was not a hope for his return, but an acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid, and a connection that could never truly be broken. Night fell, and Clara stood alone in the quiet of her shop. The only sounds were the low, mechanical hum of the floral cooler and the steady, rhythmic ticking of an old wall clock, each second falling into a vast ocean of silence. The space he had occupied in her life was now an echo chamber, amplifying not his threats or his power, but the memory of his whispered confession, the feeling of his guarded heart beating beneath her hand. The distance between them was no longer measured in city blocks, but in the infinite, impassable chasm of their two worlds. And in that profound silence, the unspoken words between them screamed the loudest. Months bled into a cold, crisp winter, and the city was washed in a palette of gray stone and pale, watery sunlight. Clara had found a new rhythm, a quiet strength that had taken root in the space Damien's absence had carved out. She had paid off her mother's debts, her hands now steady, her gaze clear. The shop was hers, truly hers, a testament not to his intervention, but to her own resilience in its aftermath. One afternoon, seeking a silence that was peaceful rather than heavy, she found herself walking into the hushed, cavernous nave of the old cathedral downtown. The air was cool and smelled of ancient stone, melting wax, and a faint whisper of incense, a scent of sanctity and forgiveness that felt a world away from the blood and concrete of the city she now understood so much better. There, in a secluded back pew, shrouded in the long shadows cast by the towering stone pillars, she saw him. He was a solitary figure, his dark overcoat a stark silhouette against the diffused, holy light filtering through a high stained-glass window. He was not the king she remembered, the predator in his element of power and control. Here, in this house of silent judgment, he looked smaller, more human, his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his empire. His head was bowed, not in prayer, but in a state of profound, weary contemplation. He was a man at war with his own soul, seeking a moment of truce in a place where all men, kings and florists alike, are made equal by the silence. As if sensing her presence, he slowly lifted his head. His gaze swept through the empty pounces and across the cold stone floor, finding her with an unnerving, inevitable precision. Time stopped. The vast space of the cathedral shrank to the charged, sacred distance between them. There were no words, no sounds, only the silent, deafening conversation of their eyes. In his, she saw not the cold fire of a mob boss, but the deep, aching regret of a man who had touched the light and had to let it go. And in her own gaze, she offered not fear or judgment, but a quiet, compassionate understanding. It was a look that acknowledged everything, the danger, the protection, the sacrifice, and forgave it all. He held her gaze for a long, timeless moment, a final, silent confession passing between them. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a greeting or an acknowledgement of her presence. It was a release. It was permission. It was the final, quiet severing of the invisible chain that had bound her to his world. With a grace that seemed almost painful, he stood, turned, and walked toward a side exit, his footsteps echoing once on the stone before being swallowed by the immense silence. He did not look back. He was a phantom relinquishing his ghost, a guardian finally stepping away from his post, leaving her to stand alone, bathed in the colored light of saints and martyrs. Clara remained where she was, her hand resting on the cool, polished wood of a pew. A profound sense of peace washed over her, a quiet, final exhalation of a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. It was not the happy ending of a fairy tale, but something truer, deeper. It was closure. He had not been her savior, but her catalyst, the storm that had forced her to find the unshakable strength within her own roots. He had walked back into his darkness, but he had left her with the light, not his, but her own, now burning brighter and steadier than ever before. She was no longer a flower in a cage. She was a garden, growing in a city of stone. She turned and walked out of the cathedral's heavy doors, stepping from the solemn shadows into the bright, cold air of the afternoon. The city's noise rushed in to greet her, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of the crowd, the rhythm of a life she was now free to claim fully. He had given her back her world, and she had given him a memory of a heart he thought had long stopped beating. Their story reminds us that even the deepest shadows are cast by a light somewhere, and that redemption is not always about a grand gesture, but sometimes it is about a quiet, impossible choice. If you felt the weight of that choice, share this story so others can feel it too. Like and comment below with the one word you would use to describe their connection.